The cowboy asked the forgotten sister to supper, and the whole town learned her worth. Miriam Vale had spent so many years being unseen that when a man finally looked straight at her, she almost thought he had mistaken her for someone else. The sun was dropping behind Red Willow Ranch, turning the Kansas dusk gold and copper, when Wyatt Hale stopped at the garden fence with his hat in his hands. He was the new cowboy, though new was not quite right anymore. He had been there since spring, riding fence lines, breaking stubborn horses, and sleeping in the bunkhouse with the other men. He was quiet, dark-haired, broad in the shoulders, and never wasted words when work would do. Miriam was kneeling beside a row of beans, tying up a leaning stalk with a strip of cloth torn from an old flour sack. Her skirt was faded at the hem. Dirt marked the backs of her hands. A strand of brown hair had slipped from its pins and clung to her cheek in the heat. Wyatt cleared his throat. "Miss Vale." She looked up, blinking against the last light. He stood on the other side of the fence, hat held low, boots powdered white from the road. Behind him, the ranch yard was busy with evening sound. A wagon wheel creaked near the barn. Someone laughed on the porch. A horse stamped at flies. From the open kitchen window came her mother's voice, bright and proud, speaking of Miriam's younger sister Rose and the new ribbon she planned to wear to Sunday service. Miriam waited for Wyatt to ask after Rose. Men always did. Rose had yellow hair, a quick laugh, and the kind of face folks remembered after one meeting. Miriam had none of that. She was 28, unmarried, steady as a fence post, and useful from sunup to supper. Everyone in Cedar Bend knew her as the plain Vale sister, though most were polite enough not to say it where she could hear. Wyatt shifted his hat between his hands. "I came to ask whether you would take supper with me tomorrow evening." Miriam stared at him. The beanstalk slipped from her fingers. "With you?" "Yes, ma'am." She glanced past him toward the house. "Rose is inside." "I know. So is Bethany." "I know that too." Bethany was the youngest, still soft-faced and lively, with suitors already beginning to ride slow past the lane. Miriam rose carefully, brushing dirt from her skirt, though there was no saving it. "Then I don't understand." Wyatt's eyes did not move from her face. They were gray, calm, and serious in a way that made joking hard. "I'm asking you, Miss Vale." The words sat between them like a lantern newly lit. Miriam gave a small laugh, not because it was funny, but because something inside her did not know where else to go. "Mr. Hale, you've worked this place nearly 6 months. Surely you know who I am." "I know you rise before the bell because the stove smokes if the fire is started late. I know you water the south garden after sundown because the soil holds better then. I know you take the heel of the bread and give the soft slices to your sisters. I know you mend your father's work shirts neater than the store in town could manage." Her throat tightened before she could stop it. He looked down once at his hat brim, then back at her. "And I know I've wanted to ask you to supper for a good while." No one had spoken to her that way before, not with notice in every word. Miriam felt suddenly aware of her rough hands, her old dress, the damp curl of hair against her cheek. "I would not make fine company," she said. "I don't need fine." The answer was plain, almost too plain. From inside the house, Rose laughed at something their mother said. The sound floated through the window like music made for another room. Miriam had stood near that music all her life without ever being part of it. Wyatt rested one hand lightly on the fence rail, careful not to reach across it. "I have a small place north of Cedar Bend. It isn't much. 1 room, a stove that argues back, and a table I made crooked because I cut one leg too short. But I have 2 chairs now. I'd be honored if you sat in one." A strange ache moved through Miriam's chest. Not because the offer was grand, it was not. A crooked table, a poor stove, 2 chairs. It sounded humble, almost foolish. But no man had ever offered her a chair as if her sitting in it mattered. She looked toward the kitchen window again. No one had noticed Wyatt at the garden fence. No one had noticed her standing there with her whole heart caught in her throat. "What time?" she asked before fear could close her mouth. His face changed only a little, but she saw it. A quiet warmth quickly held back. 6, if that suits." I have bread to set before then. I can wait if need be. No, she folded the strip of flour sack in her hand. 6 will do. Wyatt placed his hat back on his head and touched the brim. Tomorrow then, Miss Vale. He turned and walked away, slow and respectful, not looking back. Miriam watched him cross the yard, past the watering trough, and disappear beyond the barn shadows. She stood so long the garden darkened around her. A cricket began its song near the squash vines. The evening wind moved the tomato leaves with a dry whisper. Only when her mother called from the house did Miriam bend to gather the small basket at her feet. "There you are," her mother said when Miriam stepped into the kitchen. "I need those beans washed, and mind you don't let the bread overrise. Rose is trying on that blue sash after supper, and I want your eye on the stitching." Miriam set the basket on the table. Her hands moved as they always did. Wash, trim, sort, carry, mend. The room smelled of yeast and fried onions. Her father sat near the window reading the week-old paper. Bethany hummed as she polished a brooch. Rose stood before the small looking glass, holding a ribbon against her hair. No one asked why Miriam's cheeks were warm. No one asked why she kept touching the place where the flour sack strip had been wrapped around her fingers. That night after the house settled and the lanterns were blown low, Miriam opened the bottom drawer of her bureau. Beneath folded aprons and winter stockings lay her best dress. It was not truly fine. Dark green cotton, carefully kept, with a collar she had turned twice to hide the wear. She lifted it out and held it against herself in the dim light. Then she put it back. Then she took it out again. Across the room, Bethany slept soundly, one hand tucked beneath her cheek. Miriam stood barefoot on the cool floorboards, feeling foolish and young and frightened in a way she had not felt for years. What if he meant kindness? She whispered to herself. Kindness could hurt worse than cruelty sometimes. A cruel man showed his knife. A kind man might offer a dream he never meant to keep. Still, the next evening, Miriam finished the bread early. She washed the dust from her hands twice. She pinned her hair with care, then unpinned it because it looked like she was trying too hard, then pinned it again because for once she wanted to try. When she told her mother she was walking toward Widow Mercer's place to return a jar, her mother only nodded and told her not to be late. Miriam stepped onto the road with the jar in her hands and her heart beating like hoofsteps. Wyatt's cabin sat beyond a rise of pale grass where the land dipped toward a narrow creek. It was small, with a leaning stovepipe and a porch that looked as though one hard winter might take it, but the yard had been swept clean. A lantern hung from a nail by the door. On the table inside, visible through the open window, sat two plates. Miriam stopped at the gate. For one breath she almost turned back. Then the cabin door opened and Wyatt came out wearing a clean shirt, sleeves rolled down though the evening was warm. He saw her and removed his hat. "I was hoping you'd come," he said. Miriam held the jar tighter. "I said I would." "Yes, ma'am," his voice softened, "but I was still hoping." Something in her heart, long trained to expect little, trembled. He opened the gate and stepped aside, leaving room for her to choose whether to enter. Behind her lay Red Willow Ranch, where supper would begin whether she sat or not. Ahead of her waited a crooked table, a nervous cowboy, and a chair meant only for her. Miriam crossed the gate, and just as Wyatt closed it gently behind her, a rider appeared far back on the road, slowing his horse near the cottonwoods, watching the cabin as if he had not come by accident. Wyatt saw the rider too. He did not turn his head fast, and he did not reach for the rifle leaning inside the cabin door. He only paused with one hand still resting on the gate latch, his eyes narrowing toward the cottonwoods. Miriam followed his gaze. The rider sat tall on a dark horse at the bend in the road, too far for her to see his face clearly. The low sun was behind him, making him a black shape against the light. He stayed there just long enough to make himself noticed, then turned his horse and rode away toward Cedar Bend. "Do you know him?" Miriam asked. Wyatt's jaw worked once before he answered. "Might be a drifter." That did not look like a drifter. "No," he said quietly, "I suppose it didn't." A little wind moved over the dry grass. The lantern by the cabin door swayed on its nail, and its flame leaned sideways behind the glass. Miriam felt the pleasant fear in her chest change into something sharper. Wyatt opened the gate wider. "Come in, Miss Vale. Supper's ready, and I promise the beans are better company than a stranger on the road." She almost smiled, but the writer had left a mark on the evening. Inside, the cabin was cleaner than she expected. Not fine, not polished, not soft. The floorboards had gaps in places. A blanket hung across one corner to hide a washstand. A patched coat rested on a peg by the door. But the table had been scrubbed until the wood looked pale, and the two plates were set with careful space between them. In the center sat a chipped cup holding 3 wild sunflowers and 1 small blue prairie flower already wilting. Miriam stopped when she saw them. Wyatt noticed and rubbed one thumb along the edge of his belt. "I found those near the creek. I don't know if they belong in a cup, but they looked lonesome out there." "They belong," she said. His eyes lifted to hers. The simple words seemed to trouble them both. He pulled out the better chair, the one with a folded quilt over the seat. Miriam hesitated before sitting, unused to any man holding a chair for her. At Red Willow, chairs were something she carried, wiped, or pushed in for others. She could not remember the last time anyone had pulled one out and waited. She sat carefully, hands folded in her lap. Wyatt took the other chair. It creaked under him. "I hope you don't mind plain food." "I grew up on plain food." "So did I." He gave the beans a careful look, as if they might betray him. "Only difference is, yours likely had more salt." The small humor eased her. "Did you forget it?" "I forgot it first, then I remembered too hard." Miriam took a bite and found the beans salty enough to make her blink. Wyatt watched her face and sighed. "That bad?" "They are strong." "Strong is a kind word." "It is the word I chose." He laughed then, low and surprised, and the sound warmed the small room more than the stove. They ate slowly. Outside, the horse tied by the porch shifted its weight and blew through its nose. The lantern made a soft ring of light on the table. Miriam noticed things she did not mean to notice. A small burn mark on Wyatt's wrist. A nail hammered crooked into the wall. His coffee cup turned so the crack faced him, leaving her the better side. He asked her about the garden. Not in the way folks usually did, meaning how many beans, how much corn, how soon the squash would be ready. He asked what she liked growing when nobody needed it. Miriam lowered her fork. "That is a strange question." "Maybe. But you look different when you're near the flowers by the south fence." "You notice that?" "I notice more than I speak on." She looked down at her plate. "Hollyhocks," she said at last, "and sweet peas when they'll take. My mother says flowers are pretty waste when water is short." "What do you say?" Miriam thought of the small patch she watered from what was left in the bucket after the vegetables had their share. She thought of kneeling in the dawn with damp earth under her nails, touching a new blossom before anyone else woke. "I say something can be pretty and still matter." Wyatt grew still. The words had come from her before she understood they were not only about flowers. He did not rush to fill the silence. That was one of the first things Miriam began to trust about him. He left room around a person's words, as if they deserved a place to settle. After a moment he said, "My mother used to plant marigolds in old bean cans." "Did she?" "Back in Missouri. We never had much ground that was ours. My father rented more disappointment than land." He leaned back, looking toward the window where the last of the light had gone blue. "But she kept marigolds on the sill, even when there was hardly meal in the barrel. I asked her once why she bothered. She said a house needed one thing that asked nothing from it." Miriam listened with her hands still around her cup. "Is she living?" she asked gently. Wyatt shook his head. "No, ma'am." "I'm sorry." "So am I." There was no grand sorrow in his voice, only an old one, carried so long it had worn smooth. The rider on the road came back to Miriam's mind. Was that man from Missouri? Wyatt did not answer at once. A log shifted in the stove with a small crack. Outside, the night insects had started up in the grass. I don't know who he was, Wyatt said. It was not quite a lie. It was too careful to be honest. Miriam set her cup down. She knew careful answers. She had given them all her life when asked if she minded being left behind, if she minded taking the old dress, if she minded missing the dance to finish dishes. A careful answer was a door with someone standing against it. You needn't tell me, she said. His gaze sharpened with regret. It isn't that I don't want to. Then it is that you can't. Not yet. Those two words changed the room. Not yet meant there was a story. Not yet meant danger or shame or both. Miriam should have felt warned. Instead, she felt seen in another way because he had trusted her with the edge of a truth even while holding back the center. Wyatt stood to clear the plates, but she rose too. I can help. No. The word came out too quick. He softened it at once. Please sit a while. Miriam froze, one hand near her plate. At home, nobody told her to sit. They told her to hurry, fetch, mend, stir, carry, mind the stove. Even when kindly spoken, the words always pointed her toward work. Wyatt picked up both plates himself. You came to supper, not to earn it. Her eyes stung so suddenly she turned toward the window. The cabin glass showed only a faint reflection of her face, older than Rose S., plainer than Bethany S., with one loose strand of hair falling near her mouth. Yet in that dim window, for the first time in a long while, Miriam did not look like a spare woman standing near someone else's life. She looked like a guest. After supper, Wyatt walked her home beneath a wide black sky. The moon had not yet risen, and the road showed pale between the grasses. He carried the empty jar she had used as her excuse for leaving Red Willow. She told him about Widow Mercer's old rooster that chased the preacher last spring, and he laughed in the quiet way of a man who liked the sound but was not used to making it. They did not speak of the rider. Still, Miriam felt the shadow of him following from far behind. At the Red Willow gate, Wyatt stopped as he had before, not crossing onto Vale land. I'd like to ask again, he said. Next week, maybe. Miriam looked toward the house. Lamplight glowed in the windows. Shapes moved inside, her family going on without wondering much about where she had been. You may ask, she said. His face warmed. And would you answer? I might. That almost smile touched his mouth again. Then he handed her the jar, tipped his hat, and walked back down the road alone. Miriam watched until the dark took him. When she stepped into the kitchen, Rose was holding the blue sash against her waist while Bethany turned in circles, pretending to waltz. Her mother looked up only long enough to say, There you are. The dishes are waiting. Miriam tied on her apron without a word, but halfway through washing the plates, she noticed a small blue prairie flower tucked inside the empty jar. Wyatt must have slipped it there before handing it back. She closed her wet fingers around the jar and stood very still. What is that? Rose asked, leaning near. Nothing, Miriam said, too quickly. Rose's eyes moved from the flower to Miriam's face, and for the first time that evening, someone in the Vale house truly looked at her. Outside, far beyond the kitchen window, a horse passed slow along the road and did not stop. Miriam did not sleep well that night. The little blue flower stayed on the washstand beside her bed, standing in a jar no bigger than her palm. It should have been nothing. A roadside bloom. A thing that would wilt before noon. But in the dark, with Bethany breathing softly across the room and the old house creaking in the night wind, Miriam kept looking at it as if it were a question she did not know how to answer. By morning, the petals had folded at the edges. By breakfast, Rose had not forgotten it. She sat across from Miriam, bright-eyed over her coffee, while their mother moved between stove and table. Their father was already outside with the hands, and Bethany was late coming down, as usual. You walked a long way last night for an empty jar, Rose said. Miriam kept buttering a biscuit. Widow Mercer was not home. And flowers grow in jars now. Their mother turned from the stove. What flower? Nothing, Miriam said. Rose leaned back, smiling in that light way of hers that drew attention without seeming to ask for it. Miriam came in with a little blue flower tucked into her jar. I suppose Widow Mercer's hens have learned courtship. Heat climbed Miriam's neck. Her mother looked at her with mild surprise, then with something more practical. Courtship, from whom? It was only a flower. That is not an answer. Miriam set the biscuit down. Her hands wanted work, some onion to chop or dough to knead, anything that would let her look away with purpose. Rose's smile faded a little as she studied her sister. Was it Wyatt Hale? The room seemed to quiet. Their mother's brows lifted. The new cowboy. He is not so new, Miriam said. That made Rose's eyes widen because the answer gave away more than silence would have. Her mother wiped her hands on her apron. Miriam, did Mr. Hale walk you home? Yes. From Widow Mercer S. Miriam looked down. From his cabin. The word struck the kitchen like a dropped plate. Rose sat still. Bethany, who had just come in half awake, stopped in the doorway with one hand on the frame. Their mother stared. You took supper alone with a ranch hand. He asked properly. Asked who? Me. Miriam did not know why that last word came out so firm, but it did. Rose looked from Miriam to their mother. A small hurt confusion passed across her face, so quick Miriam might have missed it had she not spent a lifetime watching other people be chosen. Bethany found her voice first. What did you eat? Beans. Were they good? Miriam almost laughed. Very salty. Bethany grinned, but their mother did not. A girl ought to be careful, her mother said. Even a steady one. Even a steady one. There it was. Not a beauty. Not a young girl with ribbons to protect. A steady one. A woman expected to need less guarding because nobody thought danger would come looking for her in the shape of romance. Miriam rose and carried her plate to the basin. He was respectful. I should hope so. Still, folks talk. Folks talk when Rose wears a new ribbon. Rose's mouth parted. The words were not cruel, but they were sharper than Miriam meant them to be. She had not spent her life envying Rose exactly. Envy required believing the thing could have been yours. Miriam had only watched, the way one watches light through a window from outside. Their mother's face tightened. Mind your tone. Miriam bowed her head and reached for the dishcloth. The kitchen settled back into motion, but something had shifted. Rose no longer teased. Bethany kept stealing curious glances. Their mother gave Miriam 3 tasks at once, as if extra work might press the morning smooth again. By afternoon, the whole ranch seemed to know. Not because Miriam told anyone. She would sooner have hidden the flour under a floorboard. But Rose mentioned it to Bethany. Bethany asked one of the kitchen girls whether cowboys ever cooked supper for ladies. And by the time Miriam carried scraps to the chickens, 2 hands by the barn had gone quiet when she passed. Wyatt did not come near the house that day. She saw him at a distance, leading a sorrel mare around the training pen. His hat was low. His sleeves were rolled. The mare tossed her head, but he stayed easy with her, speaking softly, giving the rope slack and taking it back with patience. Once he looked toward the garden. Miriam pretended to be checking the bean leaves. At dusk, she found a small bundle beside the south fence. 3 sweet pea vines, roots wrapped in damp cloth. No note, no flourish, only the plants and a piece of twine tied gently around them. Miriam knelt so fast her knee hit a stone. She looked around, but Wyatt was gone. The sweet peas were thin and tired from being moved, the leaves already drooping. She touched them with one finger, careful as if they were sleeping birds. He had remembered, not only that she liked flowers, not only that flowers mattered. He had remembered the kind she had named. Behind her, the house called for supper. Ahead of her, the south fence waited in the low light. Miriam should have carried the plants inside and asked permission to put them somewhere proper. Instead, she fetched a small hand spade from the shed, loosened the ground near the fence, and planted them before anyone could tell her the water was needed elsewhere. The soil was dry. She gave them half her drinking water from the tin cup she carried. That night at supper, her father spoke of a broken gate on the west pasture. Her mother worried over Rose's dress for the church social. Bethany asked if she might go to town Saturday. Miriam passed plates, poured coffee, and said little. Then Rose, softer than before, asked, "Did Mr. Hale give you those vines?" Miriam's hand paused over the coffee pot. Their father looked up from his plate. "Hale." "One of the hands," their mother said quickly. "I know who Hale is." Her father wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Good worker, quiet, keeps to himself." "He asked Miriam to supper," Bethany said. "Bethany," their mother warned. Their father looked at Miriam then, really looked. Not long, not deeply, but enough to make her stand straighter beside the table. "That's so." "Yes, sir." He grunted. "Man can ask, I suppose." That was all, not blessing, not objection, just a door left half open. Miriam carried the coffee pot back to the stove. She told herself not to feel grateful for so little, yet she did. The following days passed with the slow trouble of weather changing. Folks did talk, but not loudly at first. Miriam heard her name in doorways and near troughs. Some said Wyatt Hale had good sense, choosing a woman who knew work. Some said it was about time someone took pity on the eldest Vale girl. Some said nothing at all but looked at Miriam as if a plain shelf had suddenly held a silver cup. Wyatt asked her to supper again the next week. This time he came to the garden fence while her mother was on the porch. He removed his hat. "Miss Vale, would you take supper with me Thursday evening?" The whole porch went silent. Miriam felt every eye on her, Rose's, Bethany's, her mother, even old Mrs. Pike's from the visiting chair near the rail. Wyatt did not look at any of them, only Miriam. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Yes, Mr. Hale, I would." A smile tugged at Bethany's mouth. Rose looked away toward the yard. Her mother pressed her lips together, though not in anger exactly. More like a woman trying to mend a seam she had never noticed was torn. Wyatt tipped his hat and left. Thursday came with a thin veil of clouds and the smell of rain that never fell. Miriam wore the same green dress because she owned no better, but she stitched a tiny loose button at the cuff and polished her boots until the cracks looked dark and clean. On the walk to Wyatt's cabin, she passed the cottonwoods where the strange rider had watched before. The road was empty. Still, the back of her neck prickled. At the cabin, Wyatt had set the table again. This time the biscuits were pale and high, and he looked almost proud of them. "You conquered the salt," Miriam said after tasting the beans. "Barely, it put up a fight." She laughed before she could stop herself. He looked at her as if the sound were worth hearing twice, but he did not say so. Instead, he showed her a rough shelf he had built by the window. "For books," he said. "Do you have books?" "One Bible, one almanac from 2 years back, and a cattle ledger that isn't mine." He looked almost embarrassed. "But I thought maybe shelves ought to be ready before the books come." Miriam ran her fingers along the uneven wood. "That is hopeful." "I'm trying to be." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. After supper, he brought out coffee, and they sat by the open door while the prairie darkened. A coyote called somewhere far off. The lantern made the room behind them glow amber. Miriam wanted to ask about the rider. She wanted to ask who had made Wyatt speak as though hope was something he had to learn. But she had carried enough secrets in her own heart to know some doors opened only when the person inside could bear the light. So she asked instead, "Why Cedar Bend?" Wyatt's hand stilled around his cup. "Work," he said, "and before that, Missouri, then Texas for a while, then no place worth naming." "That sounds lonely." It was. The honesty surprised her. He looked down at his cup. "I had a brother once, Jonah, younger than me, fast with jokes, slow with chores. He could charm bread from a locked pantry if he set his mind to it." Miriam smiled faintly. "You loved him." "I did." The past tense sat heavy. "What happened?" Wyatt looked out into the dark. For a moment she thought he would close the door again. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and drew out a folded scrap of paper, worn soft at the edges. "I got word 2 months ago that a man who rode with Jonah may be in this county." Miriam felt cold move through her. "The rider. Maybe. Is your brother in trouble?" Wyatt closed his hand around the paper. "My brother is dead." The night seemed to stop breathing. Miriam did not speak. She only sat beside him, close enough to hear the tired draw of his breath, far enough to let grief keep its dignity. Wyatt swallowed. And if that rider is who I think he is, then he knows something about it that no one ever told me. Before Miriam could answer, a horse snorted outside. Wyatt rose at once. The cabin lantern flickered as the door swung wider. Miriam stood behind him, one hand gripping the back of the chair. Out near the fence, half hidden in the dark, a folded paper had been pinned to the gate with a small knife. Wyatt stepped into the yard and pulled it free. He read it under the lantern light, and all the warmth left his face. Miriam came close enough to see only 5 words written in a hard, slanted hand. "Stop asking after Jonah Hale." Wyatt folded the paper once, then twice, but his fingers were not steady. Miriam watched the small knife in his other hand catch the lantern light. It was not a large blade, nothing meant for a fight, just a pocket knife driven into the gatepost deep enough to hold a warning in place. Somehow that made it worse. Whoever had left it had come close to the cabin, close enough to hear voices maybe, close enough to see Miriam sitting inside. "Wyatt," she said softly. He looked toward the road. The night beyond the fence was black and wide. Grass moved in the wind. Somewhere near the creek, a horse gave a nervous snort, but no rider showed himself. "I'll walk you home now," Wyatt said. "You don't have to do that this minute." "I do." His voice carried no anger, but there was a hard edge under it that had not been there before. He stepped inside, took his hat from the peg, and reached for the rifle by the door. Miriam's heart tightened. "Is that needed?" He stopped, hand on the rifle stock. For a moment she saw 2 men in him, the gentle one who saved a blue flower in a jar and the wounded one who had spent too many nights waiting for bad news to step from the dark. At last he let go of the rifle. "No," he said, though it cost him something. "Not for walking you home." He took the lantern instead. They left the cabin with the dishes still unwashed and the coffee cooling on the table. Miriam glanced back once from the gate. The 2 chairs stood in the yellow light, one pushed slightly away where she had risen too fast. The little cup of wildflowers sat between the plates, trembling whenever the wind touched the door. The road to Red Willow had felt almost sweet the week before. Now every cottonwood seemed to hide a face. Wyatt walked on the side nearest the open land. His eyes kept moving, not wildly but with care. Miriam knew enough of men to know fear often dressed itself as watchfulness. "Tell me about Jonah," she said. Wyatt did not answer at once. Their footsteps brushed the pale dirt. The lantern swung from his hand and made shadows leap across the wagon ruts. "He was 18, Wyatt said at last. "Thought the world owed him a chance to be more than poor. Maybe it did." "Was he like you?" "No." A faint smile touched his mouth and disappeared. "He was prettier." Miriam looked over, startled. Wyatt glanced at her. "That was his word, not mine. He used to say, 'Wyatt, you got the serious face and I got the pretty one. Together we make one decent man.'" The smile in his voice broke Miriam's heart more than grief would have. "He went south with a trail crew," Wyatt continued. "Said he'd be back by winter with wages enough to buy our mother a real stove. But winter came and no Jonah. Then spring. Then a letter from a man I never met. Said Jonah had died in a card-room argument near Abilene." Miriam's step slowed. "Was that true?" "I don't know. The letter had no proper name, just initials. Dr. It said not to come asking questions." "And you came anyway?" "He was my brother." The answer was simple, and because it was simple it carried more weight. Miriam looked at the lantern glow on his hand. A faint scar crossed 2 knuckles, pale against sun-browned skin. "Do you think the writer left that note?" "I think he wants me to believe he did." "Why?" Wyatt's eyes moved across the dark line of the pasture. "A warning can be honest, or it can be bait." The words chilled her. At the ranch gate he stopped as always. Even with danger near, even with his jaw tight and his thoughts elsewhere, he did not step onto Vale land without being asked. Miriam turned to face him. "You should speak to Sheriff Dawes." "I will. Tonight. Tomorrow." Wyatt. The way she said his name surprised them both. It came without Miss or Mister, without fence or distance. Just Wyatt, carried by worry. His eyes softened for one breath. "I won't do anything foolish tonight," he said. "You have my word." She wanted to believe a man's word could hold back trouble. She had lived too long on a ranch to know better. "Then at least do not walk home by the creek path." "I won't. And light both lanterns when you get in. That stove of mine already thinks I'm made of lamp oil." "I mean it." "I know." The porch door opened behind her, spilling warm light into the yard. Rose stepped out with a shawl around her shoulders. Her gaze moved from Miriam to Wyatt, then to the lantern in his hand. "Mama was asking," Rose said. Miriam turned. "I'm coming." Wyatt touched his hat brim, but his eyes stayed on Miriam. "Good night, Miss Vale." The return to Miss Vale felt like a door gently closed for the sake of others. "Good night, Mr. Hale." Rose watched him walk away. For once she did not tease. She waited until his lantern had moved down the road like a low star before speaking. Something happened. Miriam held the empty jar against her waist. "Why do you say that?" "Because he looked like a man listening for thunder." Inside, the house was warm with the ordinary life that had always held Miriam in place. Her mother stood by the stove, stirring gravy. Bethany was sewing a loose button onto a glove and making a poor job of it. Her father sat at the table with a cup of coffee, mud still dried along one boot. "You're late," her mother said. "I know." "Did he keep you?" The question was not accusing exactly, but it carried old worry and fresh curiosity in equal measure. "No," Miriam said. "There was trouble on the road." Her father's cup paused halfway to his mouth. "What kind?" Miriam looked at him. She thought of the note, the knife, Wyatt's dead brother, the rider in the cottonwoods. She thought of how easy it would be to say nothing and let Wyatt carry his own burden alone, the same way she had carried hers. "A man may be following Mr. Hale," she said. "Someone connected to his brother's death." Her mother went still. "Death." Rose drew her shawl tighter. Her father set the cup down. "Hale tell you this?" "Yes." "Then Hale should tell the sheriff." "He means to." Her father gave a low grunt, the kind that meant he was thinking harder than he wanted to show. "I'll ride into town in the morning and mention it to Dawes." Miriam blinked. "You will?" "If trouble's circling one of my hands, it's circling my ranch too." He looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude on her face. "Besides, man shouldn't be left alone with a thing like that." The words settled over the kitchen. Miriam wondered if her father knew what he had said. Man shouldn't be left alone, but women often were, especially the steady ones. Left alone with work, with silence, with small hurts nobody named because nobody thought they were heavy enough to break a person. After supper she lay awake again. The blue flower had finally wilted, its stem bent against the glass. She did not throw it away. Not yet. The next morning broke gray and windless. Her father rode to town before breakfast. Wyatt did not come to the ranch yard until nearly noon, and when he did, a quiet murmur followed him among the hands. Miriam saw him speak with the foreman near the barn, then with Sheriff Dawes, who had ridden back with her father. The sheriff was a square man with a sun-reddened neck and careful eyes. He listened while Wyatt spoke, turning the little warning note over in his thick fingers. Miriam watched from the kitchen doorway, wiping the same clean cup long after it was dry. Rose came to stand beside her. "Do you care for him?" Rose asked. Miriam's hand stilled. Outside, Wyatt looked tired in the daylight. Not weak, never that, but tired as if the night had sat on his shoulders until morning. "I barely know how to answer that," Miriam said. "That means yes." Miriam turned toward her sister. Rose did not smile. Her blue ribbon was tied in her hair, pretty as ever, but there was a searching look in her face now. "I thought he would ask me first," she admitted. The honesty landed softly between them. "So did I," Miriam said. Rose looked down at her hands. "I am ashamed of that." Miriam did not know what to say. It was the first time Rose had ever placed her own beauty on the table as something that might have hurt someone else. Before either sister could speak again, Sheriff Dawes raised his voice in the yard. "Wyatt Hale, if a man comes warning you not to ask after your own blood, then he's either guilty or scared. Either way, we'll find him." Wyatt nodded, but his gaze moved past the sheriff, past the barn, past the men. It found Miriam in the kitchen doorway. For one brief moment, all the noise of the ranch seemed to fall away. He did not smile. He did not tip his hat. He only looked at her with the kind of quiet gratitude a man could not speak in front of others. Then a shot cracked somewhere beyond the west pasture, not close enough to hit the yard, not aimed at a person, but loud enough to scatter the horses and send Bethany crying out behind Miriam. Every man in the yard turned. A dark rider broke from the ridge, racing north through the dust. And tied to the fence where Wyatt had been standing only minutes before was Jonah Hale's old red neckerchief. For one breath, nobody moved. The red neckerchief hung from the fence rail like a piece of fire caught in the wind. It was faded at the edges, torn near one corner, and tied in a careless knot that looked almost mocking. Wyatt stared at it as if the whole past had risen out of the dust and fastened itself to Red Willow Ranch. Then the horses in the corral started plunging. "Easy now," the foreman shouted, running toward the rails. Men scattered. One grabbed a rope. Another swung wide to close the barn gate before the frightened team could bolt. Sheriff Dawes drew his revolver but kept it low, eyes fixed on the ridge where the rider had vanished. Miriam stepped from the kitchen doorway before she knew she had decided to move. Rose caught her arm. "Don't." But Miriam gently pulled free. Wyatt had not touched the neckerchief yet. He stood close to it, shoulders stiff, hands curled at his sides. The wind lifted the red cloth and let it fall again. Miriam saw his face, and all at once he was no longer the quiet cowboy who made salty beans and remembered sweet peas. He was a brother standing before the last thing he had of a dead boy. Sheriff Dawes came beside him. "That yours?" Wyatt's voice was rough. "Jonah S." "You're certain?" Wyatt reached slowly and touched the cloth with 2 fingers. "I tied this knot myself." Miriam stopped a few steps away. The sheriff looked toward the ridge. "He wanted you to see it." "What?" "He wanted me to chase him," Wyatt said. "Then you won't." Wyatt's jaw tightened. For a terrible second, Miriam thought he would argue. She imagined him saddling a horse, riding hard after the dark shape, leaving reason behind in a cloud of dust. Men had died for less than a brother's memory, but Wyatt only closed his eyes once. "No," he said, "I won't." The answer was quiet, but Miriam knew it cost him dearly. Her father came from the barn with his rifle in hand. He did not raise it. West pasture has a cut through the ridge. Ryder could be halfway to Miller's Wash by now. Sheriff Dawes nodded. "I'll send 2 men around the long way. Nobody rides alone." Wyatt took the neckerchief down at last and held it in both hands. The cloth looked small against his palms. Miriam wanted to say something, anything, but grief had no easy handle, so she stood near him in the dust while the ranch yard stirred around them, and after a moment he seemed to notice she was there. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. "Neither should you be standing alone." His eyes met hers. That small answer reached him. She saw it in the way his shoulders lowered just a little. Sheriff Dawes tucked the warning note into his coat pocket and looked between them. "Miss Vale, did you see the rider clear?" "Only from the back. Dark coat, dark horse, sat high in the saddle." "Anything else?" Miriam frowned, trying to hold the image still in her mind. The shot, the dust, the ridge, the horse moving fast. "He rode with his left shoulder low," she said, "like it troubled him." "What?" Wyatt turned sharply. "Left shoulder." "Yes." The sheriff noticed his face. "That means something." Wyatt looked down at Jonah's neckerchief. "The man who wrote me about Jonah signed Dr. There was a trail cook named Daniel Rusk who rode with my brother near Abilene. Jonah wrote about him once. Said Rusk had a bad left shoulder from being thrown by a mule." Sheriff Dawes gave a low whistle. "Now that's something." Miriam felt the yard shift around them. The rider was no longer just a shadow. He had a possible name, a wounded shoulder, a reason to hide, and maybe a truth he feared. By late afternoon, the ranch settled into uneasy work. Two men rode with the sheriff toward Miller's Wash. Wyatt stayed, though every line of him looked pulled toward the road. Miriam watched him repair a broken corral latch with careful hands, pausing once to draw Jonah's neckerchief from his pocket and fold it smaller. At supper, the Vale table was quieter than usual. Rose did not speak of ribbons. Bethany did not hum. Their mother served stew with too much pepper and did not notice. Miriam stood to pour coffee, but her father pointed to the chair beside Rose. "Sit a spell," he said. Miriam looked at him, uncertain she had heard right. "I can pour my own coffee." Her mother glanced at him, surprised, but said nothing. Miriam sat. It was only a few minutes. The meal still needed tending. The bread still needed slicing. But for those few minutes, no one asked her to rise. Her hands rested empty in her lap, and the feeling was so strange she almost did not know what to do with herself. Rose passed her the bread plate without being asked. Their fingers touched. "I'm glad he didn't ride after that man," Rose said softly. Miriam looked down at the bread. "So am I." If this moment touched your heart, stay with the story, because sometimes love begins not with a kiss, but with someone choosing not to leave when pain calls him away. That evening, after the dishes were done, Miriam went to the south fence with a small pail of water. The sweet pea vines were still weak, but one tiny tendril had caught hold of the string she tied for it. She bent close and guided it gently. A horse slowed on the road. She looked up, expecting Wyatt. Instead, a stranger sat beyond the fence, not the rider from the ridge. This man was older, narrow-faced, with a gray beard and a coat too fine for the dusty road. He removed his hat with a politeness that felt practiced. "Evening, miss." Miriam stood pail in hand. "Evening. You'd be one of the Vale daughters." She did not answer. His eyes moved past her toward the ranch house, then back to her face. "I'm looking for Wyatt Hale." Miriam's fingers tightened around the pail handle. "Then you should ask at the bunkhouse." "I might." He smiled without warmth. "But I was told he keeps close company with a plain brown-haired woman who tends flowers by the fence." The words struck with quiet cruelty. Miriam lifted her chin. "Who told you that?" The man leaned slightly in the saddle. "Tell Hale that Daniel Rusk wants to speak with him, alone, tomorrow at sundown, Old Stone Well near Miller's Wash." Her heart beat hard. "And if he won't come?" The stranger's smile faded. "Then I reckon the whole county can hear how Jonah Hale truly died." He turned his horse before she could call out. Dust rose behind him, thin and pale in the evening light. Miriam stood frozen beside the sweet peas. Then she saw something lying in the road where his horse had been, a torn corner of paper. She stepped through the gate and picked it up. Only a few words remained, written in a familiar hard slant. "Not dead by accident." Miriam looked toward the darkening road, then toward Wyatt's distant cabin beyond the rise. Whatever truth had come to Cedar Bend, it had not come for Wyatt alone anymore. Miriam did not run to Wyatt's cabin at once. She wanted to. Every part of her wanted to gather her skirt, hurry down the road, and put the torn paper into his hands before night swallowed the last of the light. But fear had a way of making a person either reckless or careful, and Miriam had spent too many years holding a household together to let fear make her foolish. She folded the scrap and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Then she stood by the south fence until her breathing slowed. The stranger's words still burned. A plain brown-haired woman who tends flowers by the fence. Plain. It should not have hurt. She had heard it all her life, sometimes dressed as kindness, sometimes spoken with careless laughter, sometimes wrapped inside praise for her steady hands. But from that stranger the word felt like a brand. Not because he had called her plain, but because he had used it as if that was the only way to name her. Miriam Vale. That was her name. She whispered it once to the darkening road as if reminding the evening itself. Miriam Vale. Behind her, the ranch house glowed with supper lamps. Rose called from the porch, asking if she was coming in. Miriam turned and saw her sister standing in the doorway, ribbon gone from her hair, shawl held close around her shoulders. "In a moment," Miriam answered. But Rose must have heard something in her voice, because she came down the steps and crossed the yard. "What happened?" Miriam looked toward the bunkhouse. A few cowboys were washing up near the trough. Wyatt was not among them. A man came asking for Wyatt. Rose's face lost color. "The rider?" "No, another man. Older, gray beard, fine coat. He said Daniel Rusk wants to meet Wyatt tomorrow at sundown by the old stone well near Miller's Wash." "Alone?" "Yes." Rose glanced toward the house, then back to Miriam. "You have to tell Papa." "I will." "And the sheriff." "Yes." Rose reached for her hand. "Miriam, promise me you won't go anywhere by yourself." The worry in her sister's face caught Miriam off guard. Rose had always been kind in her way, but her kindness had often floated on the surface, easy and pretty, never asked to carry weight. Now it sat heavy in her eyes. "I promise," Miriam said. Together they went inside. Their father listened without interrupting, his coffee forgotten at his elbow. Their mother pressed one hand to her mouth when Miriam repeated the stranger's message. Bethany began to cry quietly, not with loud sobs, but with frightened tears she kept wiping away as if ashamed of them. Miriam placed the torn paper on the table. Her father bent over it. "Not dead by accident," he read. Rose stood close behind Miriam, close enough their sleeves touched. "We send for Dawes tonight," her father said. "The sheriff is likely still searching near Miller's Wash," Miriam replied. "Then I'll ride to town and find his deputy." "I'll go," Rose said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. She lifted her chin, though her hands trembled. "Not alone. I can take Tom from the barn. He rides faster than you on that old bay, Papa, and people in town will listen if I say there's trouble. They always listen to me." The last words came with a small bitterness that made Miriam turn. Rose looked at her then, and for the first time Miriam understood that beauty could be a cage too, only lined with softer cloth. Rose was heard often, but perhaps not always known. Their father shook his head. "You're not riding after dark." "Then send one of the hands." "I'll send two." By the time riders left for town, the house had grown tense and quiet. Miriam stayed near the kitchen window, watching the road. Every creak of the porch, every shift of a horse outside made her turn. Wyatt came just after full dark. He did not ride up boldly. He stopped at the edge of the yard, dismounted, and came to the porch with his hat in hand. Her father met him there before Miriam could step outside. "I heard a man came here," Wyatt said. "Word travels quick," her father replied. "One of the boys saw tracks by the south fence and told me." Miriam moved into the doorway. Wyatt's eyes found her at once. Whatever he had meant to say next seemed to leave him. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." "Did he frighten you?" "Yes," she said, "but not enough to forget what he said." Her father handed Wyatt the torn paper. Wyatt read it beneath the porch lantern. His face closed so completely that Miriam felt shut out of the very grief she wanted to comfort. "Daniel Rusk," Wyatt said. Her father crossed his arms. "You know him." "I know of him. And he wants you alone by the old well." "I heard." "You're not going." Wyatt looked up. Miriam's father did not soften. "You work my ranch. That makes your trouble my trouble while you're on my land, and my daughter's name has been dragged into it now. So no, Mr. Hale, you won't be riding alone to meet a man who leaves knives in gates and fires shots over pastures." For a moment Miriam thought Wyatt would refuse the help out of pride. Then his gaze moved to her, not helpless, not rescued, only seen. "I won't go alone," he said. The promise loosened something in her chest. They spoke on the porch while the women stayed near the open door, hearing enough. The plan was simple, too simple perhaps. Sheriff Dawes and his deputy would be told. At sundown, Wyatt would ride near the old stone well, but not alone. Men would be placed along both sides of Miller's Wash, hidden far enough not to scare Rusk off, but close enough to close in if trouble began. "And you will stay here," Wyatt said to Miriam. She gave him a look. That sounded like an order. His mouth tightened. It was meant as concern. Concern can still wear the wrong boots. Rose made a small sound that might have been a laugh, then covered it. Wyatt lowered his eyes, and when he raised them again, the hardness had eased. "You're right, I'm sorry." Miriam folded her hands. "I do not mean to ride into danger, but do not speak to me as if I'm another chair to set aside until the men are done deciding." Her father shifted uncomfortably. Her mother looked down at her apron. Wyatt heard her, truly heard her. She saw it happen. "No," he said quietly, "you are not that." The porch went still. Miriam felt the words all the way through her. Not a chair, not a pair of hands, not a plain woman named by others, not a useful thing to be protected only because it served the household. A woman. Wyatt stepped back, giving the space respect. "I'll come by in the morning before I ride to town with your father, if that suits." "It suits." He touched the brim of his hat, but before he turned, he looked at her mother and father. "I'm sorry trouble came near your home." Her father nodded once. Trouble has a way of coming where truth is hiding. Wyatt's face changed at that, as if the old rancher had struck nearer than he knew. After he left, Miriam did not sleep much. She lay listening to the wind move along the eaves and watched the moonlight stretch across the floor. Bethany, half asleep, reached from her bed and took Miriam's hand in the dark. "Do you think Mr. Hale is good?" Bethany whispered. Miriam turned her head. "Yes," she said, "but good men can still be haunted." "Are you afraid of him?" "No." "Are you afraid for him?" Miriam closed her fingers around her sister's hand. "Yes." Morning came pale and cold. A thin mist lay over the low fields, softening the ranch into gray shapes. Miriam rose before the others and went to the south fence. The sweet peas had survived the night. Their small leaves trembled with dew. Wyatt arrived while she was there. He stopped on the road side of the fence just as he had the first time he asked her to supper. His hat was in his hands. His eyes showed the sleepless night. "I brought something," he said. From his coat pocket he took a small folded cloth. Inside were seeds, dark and tiny. "Molly Mercer gave me these, said they're hollyhocks. I thought maybe your fence could use them come spring." Miriam stared at the seeds. "With everything happening," she said, "you thought of flowers." His thumb brushed the edge of the cloth. "I thought of you." The mist, the fence, the cold morning all seemed to fall silent. Miriam could not look away. For a heartbeat she felt the pull of every story Rose had lived so easily. The soft glance, the chosen gift, the world stopping because someone's attention had found you and stayed. Then Wyatt's expression darkened, not from regret but from the weight waiting beyond them. "If things go badly today," he said, "there's something I need you to know." Miriam's heart tightened. "Then tell me now." He looked toward the east where the sun was climbing behind the mist. "I came to Cedar Bend looking for Daniel Rusk. That much is true." He swallowed. "But I stayed because of you." She stood with the hollyhock seeds between them, unable to speak. Hoofbeats sounded from the yard. Her father was saddling up. Wyatt stepped back from the fence. "I'll come back after sundown." "You said that like a promise." "It is." But as he rode away with her father toward town, Miriam saw a strip of red cloth tied to a cottonwood far down the road, fluttering in the morning wind like Jonah Hale's ghost pointing toward Miller's Wash. Sundown came too slowly. All day, Red Willow Ranch moved as if the whole place were holding its breath. Men spoke in lower voices. Horses were saddled earlier than needed. Even the chickens scratched near the shed with quick, nervous motions, as though they too had heard that trouble was waiting near Miller's Wash. Miriam tried to work. She kneaded bread until her wrists ached. She swept the kitchen twice. She sorted beans that were already sorted, then burned one pan of biscuits because she kept looking out the window toward the road. Her mother said nothing about the biscuits. That alone showed how strange the day had become. Rose sat at the table hemming a sleeve, but her stitches were uneven. Bethany polished the same spoon for 10 minutes, her young face pale. "He'll come back," Bethany said suddenly. No one had spoken Wyatt's name, but everyone knew who she meant. Miriam kept her hands in the flour bowl. He promised. Her mother turned from the stove. Men make promises before they know what a road will ask of them. The words were not unkind, but they landed hard. Rose set down her needle. Mama. Their mother pressed her lips together, then looked at Miriam with tired eyes. I only mean you must guard your heart. Miriam wiped flour from her fingers. I have guarded it most of my life. The kitchen went quiet. Her mother looked as if she wanted to answer, but no answer came. Maybe she was seeing at last how many locked doors Miriam had lived behind while the rest of them praised her for being steady. Near noon, Sheriff Dawes rode in with 2 men and took coffee on the porch with Miriam's father. Wyatt came with them. He did not come to the kitchen door, though Miriam knew he had seen her there. He stood by his horse, checking the cinch, his face calm in that dangerous way men sometimes wore when they had already placed themselves inside the trouble ahead. Miriam stepped onto the porch before anyone could stop her. Wyatt looked up. The yard noise seemed to fade. A bridle jingled. A horse switched its tail. Dust moved low across the hard ground. You said morning, Miriam said. I did. And now it is noon. I know. It was not the hour she cared about. They both understood that. Wyatt came closer, stopping at the bottom step. Sheriff wanted to ride the wash before dusk. I came to say I'm still keeping my word. Miriam held the porch rail. You will not meet Rusk alone. No. You will not chase him if he runs. No. You will not let grief make a fool of you. At that his mouth changed, almost a smile and almost pain. I'll try hard not to. That is not the same answer. No, he said, it's the honest one. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind lifted a strand of her hair and blew it across her cheek. Before she could fix it, Wyatt raised his hand slightly, then stopped himself, remembering where they stood and who might be watching. Miriam saw the small restraint and loved him a little for it. From her apron pocket, she drew the folded cloth of hollyhock seeds and placed it in his hand. His brows pulled together. These were for you. They still are, bring them back. The words came out softer than she meant, but not weak. Wyatt closed his fingers over the seeds as if she had given him something sacred. I will, he said. This time the promise did not feel easy. It felt like a rope stretched across a river. Sheriff Dawes called his name. Wyatt stepped back. He touched the brim of his hat, but his eyes stayed on Miriam until he turned away. The riders left in a line of dust. Miriam watched them until the road emptied. If you believe one small promise can hold 2 hearts together, don't forget to stay with this story, because the truth waiting at Miller's Wash is not the only truth that must come out. The old stone well stood in a shallow basin where the land broke into pale rock and scrub. Miller's Wash had once carried good water in spring, but now it was mostly dry, a winding scar through the earth with cottonwoods leaning over its banks. The well had no bucket anymore, only a ring of weathered stones and a broken post beside it. Wyatt reached the rise before sundown with Sheriff Dawes on one side and Miriam's father on the other. 2 deputies circled wide. Another pair of ranch hands took cover among the cottonwoods. The plan was clean enough, but plans had a way of falling apart once another man brought fear to them. You stand by the well, Sheriff Dawes told Wyatt. Let him show himself. Do not move until I say. Wyatt nodded. Miriam's father looked at him. You got that cloth she gave you? Wyatt touched his coat pocket. Yes, sir. Then remember somebody expects you back. The old rancher said it gruffly, almost like an order, but Wyatt understood. He walked down into the basin alone and stood near the well, the sinking sun behind him. For a while nothing happened. The sky turned orange, then red near the horizon. A hawk slid over the wash without a sound. Wyatt heard his own breathing. He heard leather creak when he shifted his weight. He heard the old anger in him whisper that Jonah had been waiting too long. Then a voice came from the far bank. You look more like your mother than he did. Wyatt turned. A man stepped from behind the cottonwoods. Daniel Rusk was not the dark rider from the ridge. He was the gray-bearded stranger who had spoken to Miriam, though now his fine coat was gone, replaced by a trail jacket worn white at the seams. His left shoulder sat lower than the right, just as Miriam had noticed from the running horse. Wyatt kept his hands open at his sides. "Rusk." Daniel's eyes moved over the basin. "You brought company." "You told me to come alone. I didn't agree." A dry smile crossed Rusk's face. "Smarter than Jonah, then." Wyatt's breath caught. The sheriff stayed hidden, so did the others. The whole wash seemed to listen. "What happened to my brother?" Wyatt asked. Daniel stepped closer, but not too close. His face looked older than it had at Red Willow, and fear lived in the lines around his mouth. "Jonah found something he shouldn't have." "What?" "A ledger, names, payments, stolen cattle sold under clean brands." Wyatt's hands curled, then opened again. "Whose names?" Daniel glanced toward the ridge. That glance was enough. Wyatt felt the trap before he understood it. A second rider appeared above the basin, dark horse, dark coat, rifle laid across his saddle. The same rider who had watched Wyatt's cabin. The same rider who left Jonah's neckerchief. He was younger than Rusk, with a narrow face and a scar near his chin. Sheriff Dawes rose from cover. "Drop it." The rider swung his horse hard. Everything happened at once. The horse reared. A deputy shouted. The rifle fired, but the shot went wild, cracking against stone. Wyatt moved toward Rusk, not away, because the older man had frozen in the open. Miriam's father fired into the air to turn the horse from the wash, and the dark rider lost control for one costly second. Sheriff Dawes and the ranch hands closed in. The rider tried to bolt down the far side, but the horse stumbled in loose rock. He fell hard, rolled, and lay stunned in the dust while his rifle skidded away. No blood spread. No terrible cry followed. Only dust, shouted orders, and the hard breathing of men who had come too close to disaster. Dawes reached him first. "Elias Crow," he said, hauling the man up by his collar. "I should have known." Wyatt stood beside the well, chest heaving. Daniel Rusk had gone pale. "Elias Crow," Wyatt repeated. Miriam's father lowered his rifle. "Crow runs half the buying pens east of town." "And cheats the other half," Dawes said. "Never could prove it." Wyatt stepped toward Daniel. "Where is the ledger?" Daniel swallowed. "Hidden." "Where?" The older man looked at Elias Crow, now held between two deputies, then at Wyatt. "Jonah gave it to me before Crow's men caught him," Daniel said. "I was afraid. I ran. I let folks believe your brother died over cards, because the truth had powerful men tied to it." Wyatt's voice shook. "You let my mother die thinking her son threw his life away in some filthy argument." Shame bent Daniel's head. "Yes." Wyatt took one step forward. Miriam's father moved slightly, not blocking him, only reminding him that others were there. Wyatt stopped. The silence stretched. Then he reached into his coat pocket and closed his hand around the hollyhock seeds. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "Where is the ledger?" Daniel's eyes filled with tears he did not deserve and perhaps had carried too late. "In Cedar Bend, under the floor of the old livery office." Jonah scratched his initials beneath the loose board. Sheriff Dawes turned to his deputy. "Ride now." The deputy mounted and left at a gallop. Wyatt stood very still. The sun had dropped fully behind the ridge. The wash was turning purple with evening. Jonah's truth had finally spoken, but it had not brought him back. It only opened the grave of every lie told over him. Miriam's father came near. "You kept your word, Hale." Wyatt looked down at his closed fist. Inside it, wrapped in cloth, were seeds for a spring he suddenly wanted badly to see. But far across the darkening land, toward Red Willow Ranch, a thin column of smoke rose where no smoke should have been. Wyatt saw the smoke first because he had been looking toward Red Willow before anyone else thought to. For a heartbeat, he did not understand what he was seeing. The evening had settled low and purple over the land, and the line between cloud and dust was easy to mistake. But then the smoke thickened, rising in a dark thread beyond the ridge, exactly where the ranch house would be if a man drew the distance straight through his own heart. Miriam. Her name struck him so hard he moved before thought could catch him. "My horse," he said. Sheriff Dawes turned. "Hale, wait." But Wyatt was already running up the wash. Miriam's father looked toward the smoke and went white beneath the dust on his face. "That's Red Willow." The sheriff swore under his breath, then pointed at the deputies. "Keep Crow tied and Rusk watched. The rest of you ride." No man needed telling twice. They thundered out of Miller's Wash with the dark coming behind them. Wyatt rode in front, bent low over his horse's neck, one hand tight on the reins, the other closed around the cloth packet of hollyhock seeds still in his coat. The little bundle pressed against his chest with every stride, a soft thing carried through a hard ride. The smoke grew clearer. Not the house, Wyatt prayed. Not the kitchen. Not the room where Miriam stood by the window with flour on her hands and worry in her eyes. When they topped the last rise, the ranch came into view. The barn was not burning. The main house still stood. The smoke came from the hay shed near the south fence. Men were already running with buckets. Rose stood near the pump, her skirt dark with spilled water, passing full pails as fast as the hands could take them. Bethany was on the porch with Mrs. Vale, both holding wet cloths over their mouths. Sparks flew from the shed roof, but the wind had turned away from the house, carrying most of the smoke toward the open pasture. Wyatt searched the yard. He did not see Miriam. His horse slid to a stop so sharply dirt flew beneath the hooves. Wyatt swung down before the animal settled. "Where is she?" he shouted. Rose turned at his voice. Her face was streaked with soot. Miriam went to the south fence. The sweet peas were near the shed. Wyatt's blood chilled. Before anyone could stop him, he ran. The south fence lay beyond the worst of the smoke, but the shed heat had curled the air. A lantern had shattered near the corner, its oil spreading a black stain through the dirt. It was no accident. Wyatt saw that at once. Someone had set the fire small and mean, close enough to scare, close enough to warn, not close enough to destroy unless the wind chose wickedly. Then he saw Miriam. She was kneeling beside the flower bed with a wet feed sack in her hands, pressing it over the dry grass where Sparks had jumped. Her hair had fallen loose down one side. Soot marked her cheek. The sweet pea vines were half crushed but not burned. Miriam. She looked up. Relief hit his knees first, then his chest. "I'm all right," she called, though her voice shook. He reached her and took the smoking sack from her hands. "You should not be this close." The fire was spreading. "You could have been hurt. So could the house." "I don't care about the house." The words came out too fierce. She stared at him. Behind them, men shouted as the last flames gave way under water and dirt. The shed roof sagged, smoking but no longer burning bright. The danger was passing, but Wyatt still felt it in his blood, felt the terrible image of arriving too late. Miriam stood slowly. Her hands were trembling. She tried to hide it by brushing soot from her skirt, but he saw. He reached for her, then stopped short of touching her before all those watching eyes. Miriam saw the restraint again. This time she closed the distance herself and placed one soot-smudged hand in his. The whole yard seemed to quiet around them. Wyatt folded his fingers around hers carefully, as though she were both strong and breakable, which perhaps every person was. "Crow?" she asked. "Caught." "And Rusk?" "Talking." "Jonah?" Wyatt swallowed. He was trying to tell the truth. They made him look foolish and reckless so no one would ask why he died. Miriam's face softened with sorrow. "I'm sorry." He looked at her hand in his. "So am I." Her father reached them then, breathing hard from the ride, his hat pushed back and his eyes full of fear he did not bother hiding. He looked at Miriam, then at Wyatt holding her hand, then at the smoking flower bed. "You hurt?" he asked. "No, Papa." "You sure?" "Yes." His gaze moved over her soot-marked face. Something in him broke open, not loudly, but enough for Miriam to see it. "I saw that smoke," he said. "Thought it was the house, thought it was the barn. Then Rose said you were out here and he stopped, jaw tight. I should have been here." Miriam's eyes filled, but she did not cry. "You came." He nodded once, as if that was all he could manage. Sheriff Dawes examined the shattered lantern and the tracks near the fence. One set led away toward the road, but not far. A young ranch hand named Owen found a horse tied in a ravine, lathered and nervous. In its saddlebag was a second strip of red cloth and a match tin with Crow's initials scratched on the lid. "Crow had help," Dawes said grimly. "Likely paid some fool to set this while we were drawn to the wash." Rose stepped forward, still holding an empty bucket. "Then the fool may be hiding close. No one crossed the east road after the smoke rose. I was at the pump. I would have seen." The sheriff looked at her with new respect. "You certain?" "I am pretty, Sheriff, not blind." Bethany gasped. Miriam nearly laughed despite everything. Dawes tipped his hat. "Point taken, Miss Vale." Within the hour, they found the hired man in a dry ditch, scared out of his wits and ready to confess before anyone asked hard. Crow had paid him to frighten Wyatt, to send the message that trouble would touch whatever he cared for. The man swore he had been told to light only the shed corner and ride off, not hurt anyone. Dawes tied him anyway. By full dark the fire was out, Crow's hired man was under guard, and Red Willow Ranch stood safe beneath a sky blurred with smoke. Miriam sat on the porch step, with a damp cloth around her shoulders. Her mother knelt before her, wiping soot from her face with a gentleness so careful it made Miriam ache. "I should not have let you run out there," her mother whispered. "You did not let me. I went." "I know," her mother's hand trembled. "That is what frightens me." Miriam studied her mother's face. It looked older in the lantern light, lined by more than years. "I have been going where I was needed since I was 12. Her mother closed her eyes. The sentence landed exactly where it had to. "I know," she said, "and I have been proud of it when I should have been ashamed of needing it so much." Miriam could not answer. Not yet. Across the yard, Wyatt stood with her father near the fence. The men spoke quietly. Then her father nodded toward the porch. Wyatt looked over, but he did not come until Mrs. Vale stood and stepped aside. He stopped at the bottom step. "May I sit?" Miriam moved the cloth to make room. He sat beside her, leaving a respectful space, though her hand still remembered his. For a while neither spoke. The ruined hay shed smoked gently in the dark. The stars came out one by one. Somewhere near the barn a horse shifted and blew softly. At last Wyatt drew the folded cloth from his coat pocket. The hollyhock seeds were still there. "I brought them back," he said. Miriam looked at the little bundle in his palm. Something about those tiny seeds surviving the ride, the wash, the smoke, and all the fear of the day touched her more deeply than any grand speech could have. "So you kept your promise." "I aim to keep more than one." Her breath caught. He did not press the words further. Not there. Not while smoke still hung over her home and fear still sat beside them. Instead, he placed the seeds in her hand and closed her fingers gently around them. "If this part made you believe quiet love can be stronger than fear, tell me in the comments whether Miriam should trust Wyatt with her whole heart, because the next choice she makes will change more than her own life." Miriam looked across the yard at her family. Her mother stood near Rose, speaking low. Bethany leaned against the porch rail, watching Wyatt with open curiosity. Her father spoke with Sheriff Dawes, but every so often his eyes came back to Miriam as if checking that she was still there. Still there. Seen. Chosen. Yet the old fear had not fully left. It sat in the corner of her heart, whispering that men praised brave women in danger, then expected them back in the kitchen when morning came. Wyatt seemed to sense the shadow. "Miriam," he said softly. She turned. "I need to ask you something, but not tonight. Tonight has taken enough." "What is it?" He looked toward the smoky field, then back to her. "Tomorrow evening, if you're willing, come to my cabin one more time." "One more?" "For a supper that begins with the truth." Before she could answer, Sheriff Dawes crossed the yard with Jonah's red neckerchief in one hand and a small leather ledger in the other. His face was grave. "We found it," he said. Wyatt stood. Miriam rose beside him. Dawes held out the ledger. "Jonah wrote more than names. He wrote a final note to you." The yard went so quiet that even the horses seemed to understand a dead man was about to speak. Wyatt did not reach for the ledger at first. He stood in front of Sheriff Dawes with soot still faint on his sleeve, one hand closed at his side, as if taking that little leather book would make Jonah's death new again. The lantern near the porch threw a soft light over the worn cover. It was scuffed, water-stained, and tied shut with a thin strip of rawhide. Miriam stood close enough to see Wyatt's throat move when he swallowed. Her father removed his hat. Rose and Bethany stood on the porch, holding hands without seeming to know it. Mrs. Vale had one palm pressed against her apron, her face pale with the shock of how quickly ordinary life could turn into a story folks would repeat for years. Sheriff Dawes held the ledger out a little farther. Deputy found it under the livery office floor, right where Rusk said, "Crow's buying records are in the first half, enough to ruin him proper and bring down whoever was helping him." His voice softened. "But in the back, there's writing addressed to you." Wyatt took the ledger. His fingers looked strong around it, but Miriam saw the tremble he could not hide. "You don't have to read it here," she said. He looked at her, and something raw moved behind his eyes. "If I wait, I may not find the courage." No one argued. He untied the rawhide and opened the ledger near the back. The pages crackled in the night air. Wyatt bent over the writing, and for a moment his face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Then he read aloud, "Wyatt, if this book reaches you, then I reckon I was not as quick as I always claimed." A broken sound left Wyatt's chest. Not quite a laugh, not quite grief, something between the two. He kept reading. "I found Crow's records by accident. He has been stealing under clean brands and paying men to look away. Rusk says we can sell the truth and ride rich, but I know better. Mama did not raise us to turn dirtier just because we were born poor." Miriam saw Mrs. Vale wipe her eyes. Wyatt's voice grew unsteady, but he did not stop. "I am taking this ledger to the law at first light. If I do not make it, I want you to know I did one brave thing before the end. Maybe that will balance out some of the foolish ones. Tell Mama I meant to come home. Tell her I still remember the marigolds in the bean cans. Tell her I was not gambling when trouble found me." The page shook in Wyatt's hands. Miriam stepped closer, not touching him, only standing where he could feel he was not alone. Wyatt drew one breath, then another. The last lines were written smaller, as if Jonah had been hurried or afraid. "And Wyatt, do not spend your whole life chasing the men who wronged me. You always were better at carrying sorrow than setting it down, but you must set this down when the truth is done. Find land. Build something. Sit at a table with someone who makes the quiet feel kind. I think that would please Mama more than revenge ever could." The final words fell into the smoky air. No one spoke. The ranch yard, the lanterns, the dark fields, the ruined hay shed, all of it seemed to lean toward Wyatt in sorrow. He closed the ledger with care. His face had gone still, but tears stood openly in his eyes. He did not turn away to hide them. That more than anything made Miriam's heart ache. Men in Cedar Bend hid tenderness as if it were a crime. Wyatt let his grief stand in the lantern light, wounded but honest. Sheriff Dawes cleared his throat. "Crow will answer for it. So will Rusk, though his telling the truth may weigh some. The court in Junction City will want the ledger." Wyatt nodded. Miriam's father spoke next. "Your brother died doing right." What? Wyatt looked down at the leather cover. "He lived doing wrong plenty of times." "A man can do both," her father said, "but it matters what he chooses when the cost comes due." Wyatt looked at him with quiet gratitude. Miriam knew then that something had ended at Red Willow that night, though not all of it was sorrow. The lies around Jonah had begun to break. The shadow over Wyatt's past had thinned. And in the same firelit yard where danger had tried to frighten love away, her own family had seen her standing beside him, not behind him. Later, when Sheriff Dawes rode off with Crow's hired man under guard and the ledger wrapped safe in oilcloth, the ranch slowly returned to breath. Men drifted toward the bunkhouse. Rose took Bethany inside. Mrs. Ale warmed coffee no one truly wanted, but everyone accepted because hands needed something to hold after fear. Wyatt remained near the south fence. Miriam found him there after helping her mother settle the kitchen. The sweet peas were bent and the earth around them was blackened in places. The air still smelled of smoke and wet ash. Above the fence, the stars were sharp and bright, as if the sky had been scrubbed clean. Wyatt crouched and touched one crushed vine. "I brought trouble right to your flowers," he said. Miriam knelt beside him. "Flowers grow back. People don't always." "No," she said softly, "but sometimes they do too, in a different way." He looked at her. She reached into her pocket and took out the little cloth of hollyhock seeds. After Sheriff Dawes handed him the ledger, Wyatt had pressed the seeds back into her palm without a word, as if he needed her to hold the future while he faced the past. Now she opened the cloth between them. "Your brother told you to build something," she said. "He did. And to sit at a table with someone who makes the quiet feel kind." Wyatt's eyes did not leave her face. "I noticed that part." "So did I." The small words warmed the cold places between them. He looked toward his cabin far beyond the rise, invisible in the dark but known to them both. "I asked you to come tomorrow. For supper that begins with the truth." "Yes." "What truth?" He rubbed a thumb over the edge of his hat brim. "That I came here hunting a dead man's answer, and somewhere along the way, I started hoping for a living woman's yes." Miriam's breath caught. He did not ask the question there. Maybe he understood that after a day of smoke and fear and dead men's words, her heart needed room to hear itself. Instead, he stood and offered his hand to help her up. She took it. His hand was warm, rough, and careful. From the porch, Rose watched them. This time, Miriam did not pull away. The next morning, Cedar Bend woke hungry for news. By noon, every porch, store counter, and church step held some version of the story. Elias Crow had been arrested. Daniel Rusk had confessed to hiding the ledger. Jonah Hale had not died over cards. Red Willow's hay shed had burned because guilty men feared honest records. And Miriam Vale had been standing in the middle of it all. That last part seemed to puzzle folks most. At the mercantile, Mrs. Pritchard stared at Miriam as she bought thread and lamp oil. "I heard Mr. Hale rode straight through smoke looking for you." Miriam counted coins into the woman's palm. "He rode because there was a fire." "Yes, but they say he shouted your name before he asked after the shed." Miriam picked up the thread. "People say many things." Mrs. Pritchard leaned forward. "Is he courting you serious?" Before Miriam could answer, Rose stepped beside her. "He would be foolish not to." Mrs. Pritchard blinked. Miriam turned to her sister. Rose's chin lifted, daring anyone in the store to laugh. No one did. Outside, Rose linked her arm through Miriam's as they crossed the street. "You didn't need to say that," Miriam said. "Yes, I did." They walked past the blacksmith shop where the hammer rang sharp and steady. A wagon rolled by, sending dust around their boots. Rose looked ahead. "All my life people have looked at me first. I liked it. I still like it sometimes. That is the ugly truth of me." She gave a small, sad smile. "But I never noticed how often looking at me first meant looking past you." Miriam did not answer right away. The town moved around them. A dog slept in the shade. Children chased each other near the trough. Church bells hung silent above the roofline. At last Miriam said, "I do not need you to make yourself smaller." Rose's eyes filled. "I just need room to stand at my own height." Rose nodded. "Then I'll make room." That evening, Miriam dressed for Wyatt's supper with no lie about Widow Mercer, no jar in her hand, no excuse folded around her courage. She wore the green dress again, but this time she pinned a small blue ribbon at the collar. It was not Rose's ribbon. It was one Miriam had found years ago in a sewing basket and saved for no reason she could name until now. Her mother came to the bedroom door and paused. "You look nice," she said. Miriam turned, surprised. Her mother stepped inside, holding a shawl. "The wind will turn cold after dark." "I can fetch mine." "I know." Her mother crossed the room and placed the shawl around Miriam's shoulders herself. Her hands lingered there. "But I wanted to do this." What? Miriam looked at her in the mirror. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Their reflections stood side by side, one older, one not young anymore, both carrying years of things unsaid. I thought being proud of your strength was the same as caring for you, her mother whispered. Miriam's throat tightened. It was not always enough, she said. No, her mother's eyes shone. It was not. That was all the apology had room to be, but this time Miriam did not feel asked to sweep it away and make everyone comfortable. She let it stand. Then she turned and kissed her mother's cheek. The walk to Wyatt's cabin felt different. Not easy, not free of fear, but chosen. The road curved past the cottonwoods, now harmless in the gold evening light. Meadowlarks called from fence posts. The dust on Miriam's boots rose with every step and settled behind her like the old life falling quiet. Wyatt was waiting by the gate, not on the porch, not inside, at the gate where it had all begun. His hat was in his hands. "You came," he said. "I said I would." His eyes moved over her face, then to the ribbon at her collar. "Blue suits you." The compliment was gentle, with no surprise hidden inside it, and that made it beautiful. He opened the gate but did not step aside yet. "Miriam, before supper, I need to ask one thing." She knew then, not the whole shape of it, but enough for her heart to strike hard. Wyatt took the little cloth packet from his pocket. The hollyhock seeds, saved and returned, passed between them so many times they had become more than seeds. "I have a cabin that still leans in a high wind," he said. "A table with one short leg. A patch of ground stubborn enough to humble any man. I have grief I am learning to set down, and I cannot promise a life without hard days." Miriam's eyes blurred. "But I can promise this. No supper in my house will begin with you standing behind a stove while others take their place. No dream of yours will be treated like pretty waste. No one who comes under my roof will call you plain and useful as if those words are the measure of you." His voice lowered. "I am asking for your heart, Miriam Vale, not your hands, not your labor, not your silence. You." She held the gate rail because the world had gone unsteady under her feet. Wyatt opened his palm with the seeds resting there. "Will you marry me?" Behind them, the prairie wind moved through the grass. Ahead of them, the cabin window glowed with lamplight and two plates waited on the table. Miriam looked at that light, then back at him. She thought of every table she had served before sitting, every ribbon handed to someone else, every joke she had swallowed, every flower she had watered from what was left. Then she smiled through her tears. "Yes," she said, "but I have one condition." Wyatt let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Name it." Miriam took the hollyhock seeds from his palm and closed her fingers around them. "We plant these before supper." Wyatt Hale had imagined asking Miriam Vale to marry him 100 different ways, but he had not once imagined kneeling in the dirt before supper with a hand spade, planting hollyhock seeds, while the woman he loved stood beside him laughing softly through her tears. Yet there they were. The sun was slipping low behind the Kansas grass. Wyatt's cabin glowed in the last amber light, humble and crooked and waiting. The gate stood open behind them. The wind moved gently over the rise, carrying the smell of dust, creek water, and beans warming on the stove. Miriam knelt beside the fence, her green dress tucked carefully under her knees, the blue ribbon at her collar lifting in the breeze. She pressed each seed into the loosened soil as if placing a promise where the earth could keep it. Wyatt watched her hands. Those hands had carried too much for too long. Bread pans, wash buckets, mending baskets, family burdens, quiet disappointments. But now they held something that asked to be loved, not used. "You know," he said, "I thought a proposal might sound finer if I stood straight and spoke like a man in a church." Miriam covered the last seed with soil. It sounded fine enough by the gate. Fine enough. She looked up at him, and there was a light in her eyes he had never seen before. Not because she had changed into someone new, but because the woman she had always been was finally standing where the sun could reach her. "Fine enough to get a yes," she said. Wyatt laughed then, full and relieved, and the sound rolled over the quiet yard like a door opening in a house long shut. They watered the seeds from a tin cup, not much, just enough to darken the soil. Miriam rested her fingers against the damp earth a moment longer than needed. "My mother always said flowers were pretty waste," she said. What do you say now? She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her palms. I say a house that has room for flowers has room for tenderness. Wyatt held out his hand. She took it. They went inside together. The cabin was not fine. The stove still smoked at one corner. The table still leaned if a man set his elbow on the wrong side. One chair was better than the other, and Wyatt had placed the better one facing the window as he always did. But there were 2 plates set with care, 2 cups, biscuits wrapped in a cloth, and a small jar of wildflowers in the center. Miriam stopped just inside the door. Wyatt saw the feeling cross her face. Not doubt, not fear exactly, something older. A woman standing at the edge of a table, waiting for habit to tell her she belonged in motion. So he did what he had done from the beginning. He pulled out her chair and waited. Miriam looked at the chair. Then she untied the apron she had brought out of habit and folded it over the back of the spare one. No, she said softly. Wyatt went still. For a heartbeat, worry moved through him. No. She smiled. Tonight we sit at the same time. The worry left him in a breath. Yes, ma'am. They sat together, and that first supper after the promise began with both of them resting in their places, neither above the other, neither serving while the other received. The beans were still too salty. The biscuits were better than they had been the first night. Miriam said so, and Wyatt accused her kindly of being generous. I am honest, she said. You are that. After supper, they did not speak of wedding plans at once. They spoke of Jonah. Wyatt told her stories he had not been able to tell before the truth came home. How Jonah once traded a good pair of gloves for a harmonica he never learned to play. How he carved their mother's initials into a windowsill and blamed the cat. How he could make a dull road seem like a fairground if he was in the right mood. Miriam listened to every word. When Wyatt's voice broke, she did not rush to mend it. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. The quiet between them was kind. The next weeks moved fast by frontier measure, though slow enough for whispers to turn into facts. Elia's crow was taken to Junction City under guard. Daniel Rusk gave full testimony, shame-faced and shaking, and the ledger named men who had hidden behind clean coats and respectable handshakes. Some lost their businesses. Some left the county before the law could ask them questions. Sheriff Dawes said justice did not always arrive pretty, but this time it arrived carrying ink, names, and a dead boy's courage. Jonah Hale was buried again in the mines of Cedar Bend. Not in earth, for his grave lay far away, but in truth. No longer a reckless fool lost to cards. No longer a shame whispered over coffee. He became a young man who found wrong and tried to carry proof into daylight. Wyatt rode one morning to the churchyard and asked Reverend Bell to ring the bell once for him. Only once. The Reverend asked. Wyatt looked toward the open prairie. Once is enough if it's heard proper. The bell rang across Cedar Bend, clear and steady. Miriam stood beside Wyatt beneath the church steps, her gloved hand near his but not touching. When the sound faded, he took a long breath and she felt something in him settle, not vanish. Grief did not vanish, but it loosened its hold enough for a man to live. Their wedding came in early December, after the first hard frost silvered the grass and put the garden to sleep. It was a small service, but not a hidden one. Miriam wore a cream dress her mother and Rose had worked on together by lamplight. There was lace at the cuffs, simple and pretty, and when Miriam first saw it laid across the bed, she touched the sleeve as if afraid it might disappear. You needn't have gone to such trouble, she said. Rose, holding pins between her lips, shook her head fiercely. Yes, we did. Bethany placed a little blue ribbon inside the dress box. For luck. Their mother stood behind Miriam and fastened the collar with trembling hands. For years I dressed your sisters like the world was waiting to see them, she whispered. Today it waits for you. Miriam looked at their reflections in the glass and did not hide her tears. Her father was waiting at the bottom of the stairs with his hat in his hands, the brim already bent from worry. When he saw her, he forgot how to speak. Miriam smiled gently. Will I do? He cleared his throat twice. You'll do more than any of us deserve. At the church, Wyatt stood near the front in a dark coat that fit him well enough if a person forgave the shoulders. His eyes found Miriam the moment she entered, and they never left her. Not once did he look surprised that she was beautiful. He looked only grateful that everyone else had finally been given the chance to notice. Rose cried before the vows. Bethany cried during them. Mrs. Vale cried through most of the hymn. Miriam did not cry until Wyatt slipped the plain gold band onto her finger and spoke the promise low enough that only she could hear. No supper starts without you. It was not part of the ceremony. It was better. They began married life in the small cabin north of Cedar Bend. The wind found every crack that first winter, and the stove remained stubborn, and money stayed close. But the house was warm in the ways that mattered. Wyatt repaired the floor one board at a time. Miriam hung curtains from flour sacks she dyed with walnut hulls. They bought a second lamp from the mercantile and placed it on the shelf Wyatt had made before he owned books. The first book they put there was Jonah's Bible, sent by a man in Missouri who had known their mother. The second was a seed catalog Miriam read like scripture. Spring came soft and green. The hollyhocks broke through first, tiny leaves brave against the cold soil. Miriam knelt beside them one morning with her shawl around her shoulders. Wyatt came out carrying coffee and stood behind her silent. "They came up," she said. "I see that. I was afraid they wouldn't." He handed her the cup. "Some things take after the people who plant them, stubborn about living." She looked up at him, and love passed between them without needing words. The flowers grew tall that summer, pink, cream, and deep red, leaning along the fence like bright witnesses. Sweet peas climbed beside them. Miriam planted marigolds in old bean cans for Wyatt's mother and set them on the windowsill. No one called them waste. When her family first came to supper at the cabin, old habits followed them through the door. Mrs. Vale tried to help at the stove. Rose carried bread to the table. Bethany admired the flowers and touched every curtain. Mr. Vale stood awkwardly near the shelf, staring at Jonah's Bible as if unsure what to do with another family's grief in the room. Miriam moved as she always had, from stove to table, table to cupboard, cupboard to stove. She poured coffee, checked beans, straightened forks, lifted the bread cloth. Then Wyatt placed one hand on the back of her chair. The room stilled. "We'll wait," he said, no sharpness, no shame, just a rule spoken gently enough to be remembered. Miriam looked at the empty chair, the better chair, her chair. Her father's hand paused halfway to the bread. Her mother's eyes filled with understanding so sudden and deep that she looked down at her lap. Rose smiled through tears. Bethany sat up straighter, as if learning something she might carry into her own life one day. Miriam untied her apron and hung it on the peg by the stove. Then she sat. No one reached for a plate until she served herself first. That became the way of Wyatt and Miriam Hale's house. Neighbors learned it. Family learned it. Children, when they came, were raised inside it. First a daughter with Wyatt's gray eyes, then a boy with Miriam's quiet way of watching before speaking. Years later, another girl arrived during a rainstorm that saved the corn. The cabin gained a second room, then a wider porch, then a long table Wyatt built himself, careful this time to make every leg even. The hollyhocks returned each spring. Some years they grew wild and tall. Some years wine bent them low. But they always came back, and Miriam always saved seeds in a small cloth packet tucked into the bureau drawer where her best dress had once waited for a life she feared would never ask for her. One July evening, long after the smoke and fear of that first year had become a story softened by time, the Hale family gathered for supper while sunset burned gold over the prairie. The windows stood open. A horse shifted outside near the rail. A lantern moved gently in the warm wind. On the table sat beans, bread, fried squash, and a jar filled with hollyhocks. Their youngest daughter, Annie, sat with her chin in her hand, watching her mother cross from the stove. "Papa," she asked, hungry and curious, "why do we always wait for Mama before we eat?" Wyatt looked down the long table. Miriam stood in the lamplight with flour on one sleeve and garden dust faint on the backs of her hands. Her hair showed a little silver now. Her face was still not the kind poets troubled themselves over, at least not the foolish poets. But to Wyatt, she looked like every good thing the frontier had ever given him. Shelter, courage, mercy, a place to set grief down, a reason to build. He rested his hand on the back of her chair just as he had done for years. "Because," he said, his voice gentle, "the first supper in this house did not begin until your mother sat down, and I decided before she ever took my name that no table of mine would forget her again." The children grew quiet, taking in the words in the simple way children do before they understand how much they mean. Miriam looked at Wyatt, and the room between them filled with all the years they had lived since a dusty evening at a garden fence. Then she sat. The table waited gladly, and outside, along the fence line, the hollyhocks moved in the summer wind, bright and tall, like a row of witnesses saying that love does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly, hat in hand, asking a forgotten woman to supper, and changes the way every meal begins. If Miriam and Wyatt's story stayed with your heart, like this story and subscribe for more romantic Wild West tales where love, courage, and healing meet on the frontier.